Hello and good afternoon. I'm Nathan Mitchell, a board member with CAMA Manitoba and a member of the Glacier Farm Media Group. I would like to welcome everyone to our webinar today. It looks like we were having another great turnout, so thank you for your support. We have a few non-CAMA members with us today, and we encourage you to check out our new website at cama.org for more information. We would appreciate your consideration to join a local chapter. CAMA has launched their new name, and we are now known as the Canadian Agri-food Marketers Alliance. Make sure to follow us on Twitter at CAMA_ACAM. Each of the provincial chapters work hard to provide the opportunity for members to connect with other agri-food marketers, to grow their skills and their passion for marketing and communications. By becoming a CAMA member, you can also reap those benefits. I would also like to remind everyone that March 10th is our second webinar in the Next in Agri-food webinar series, presented by the Village Brewery in Calgary. Check out our website for more information. We'd also like to acknowledge and recognize industry partners who have joined the CAMA National Sustaining Partner Program. These inaugural partners are committed to our ongoing focus of ensuring that CAMA continues to be a dynamic, credible, and relevant organization for Canada's agri-food marketers and communicators. Our 5 committed partners are AdFarm, AGI, Bayer, Glacier Farm Media, and Real Agriculture. Thank you to those companies for their ongoing support. Before I turn it over to our speaker, I have just a few housekeeping items to review. Please keep your camera off and muted during the presentation. If there are questions, please send them to me in the chat box on the control panel. At the end of this session, we will have a question and answer period, and we'll be able to get to many of your questions. Today's webinar will be recorded, and the link will be emailed to all participants within 24 hours. We will also be sending all the participants a follow-up survey to gather your input on the webinar today and to obtain feedback or suggestions for future CAMA events. And now to our webinar. I'm pleased to introduce our guest speaker, Brenna Mahoney. Brenna is the General Manager of Keystone Agricultural Producers, or KAP as we know it. Brenna has spent much time in communications and stakeholder relations. While working in the nonprofit industry, Brenna supported the national cereals value chain by ensuring communications and outreach were at the foundation of all organizational efforts. She has contributed to and built national coalitions and partnerships focused on advancing the Canadian brand, farm practices and market access, public trust, grain nutrition, health, and sustainability. Brenna has a passion for agriculture and working with members of the entire value chain to ensure positive collaboration from all aspects of the Canadian agricultural industry. Please welcome Brenna. Thank you, Brenna.
Thank you so much, Nathan, and thanks to Mary, and thank you to all of you who have joined the call today. I know we're all itching to get back in person and do some of these things face to face. I know I am. I'm a people person, and I'm sure like most of you are as well. So I really appreciate you guys hopping on a Zoom over your lunch hour to talk about KAP, and more importantly, talk about how communications and marketing and things like policy really do go hand in hand. I think for some of you, KAP will be new, which is why I really wanted to dig in just to some background about KAP, who we are, how we're funded, things like that. But I'm only going to be speaking for about 15-20 minutes today, or I'm going to try to. I do know a few of you on the call, so you'll know that that is a challenge for me. But I really did want to get into some discussion period with Nathan as well as all of you, because I think having some good talking time will be important for us to really, work out some interests or comments that people may have. Just going to dig right in. So one of the things that I wanted to note, and it's actually interesting, Nathan, thank you very much for reading out my bio, but my background is not in agriculture or communications. So my background is actually in textile sciences and human resource management. And I found myself in ag. And I know like a lot of people who are in the marketing communications side, sometimes we find ourselves in this industry. And because of that, we see enormous opportunity, particularly about how we communicate and how we talk about what we're doing. So a big question I get is, how did I end up at KAP, which is, an advocacy organization here in the province of Manitoba? Basically because I don't have a background in policy. It really came down to there is a recognition of that gap of how to communicate, what advocacy really means, and how the skill sets of people like yourself around the table are so critically important to building strategy and really implementing positive change for us as a sector. So for me, I feel really fortunate. I've been able to build a really great career in this industry, but most importantly, I've been able to come to it with a unique perspective, which I know a lot of you on the call do as well. So I'm going to talk about who we are as an organization. I'm going to talk about that roadmap to fostering value for our members. And I think that that really is infused in those principles that I've been able to bring forward, primarily from communication, stakeholder relations, that marketing lens. How do we actually do outreach and provide, we could be doing the best work in the world at KAP, but if we're not actually talking about it, then how are our members going to know? And why policy matters, not just for groups like us, but actually matter to people like yourself who might not be directly working with government or on policy issues, but might even be selling a product, for example, or trying to enter a new market. So I think we can talk a little bit about that nearing the end, and hopefully that will spark some good conversation. So I'm not going to read this out to you folks on the call, but I want to pick out a few things that are in here. So KAP, this is not unique to us. You'll find this in most vision statements of organizations in agriculture, is to ensure that we are focusing on building a sustainable and profitable future for Manitoba farmers. And if I could, I would broaden that to Manitoba agriculture and beyond, and change profitable to prosperous, because I think it's not just about the profits, it's about that long-term longevity, that being able to be successful for the future is really important. The other thing to highlight is that united voice, which for us who work in ag or work in the communication side or trying to even work on a project with multiple stakeholders, you'll know building a unified voice is not easy. But it takes that real commitment from people around the table to try and find that common ground. So KAP is really that facilitator of building that united voice in Manitoba. I think we have a lot of opportunities to do that better. And we'll talk about that roadmap to that value in just a moment here. And most importantly, we all are responsible working in this industry to promote what agriculture does, how we do what we do, and its contribution to the Manitoba and Canadian economies, which I think is everyone's responsibility. So we do have about 4,600 direct members. So those are direct farmer members. We are funded through a checkoff system. We then also have about 1,000 support members, so they don't quite meet the checkoff amount. So they are just in a supporter category, but they're just as valuable and they get the benefits of being a member. We also have 20 commodity members. So when we talk about that unified voice and KAP facilitating that unified voice, we cannot do that without our members as well as our commodity members, because they represent a lot of the same people that we represent. So when we come to talking about key issues and how we work together, or really trying to change policy or influence government, we need those key groups. They're absolutely essential. And that also means working with other stakeholders beyond our membership. And we're able to use those relationships that we currently have under the tent of KAP to help grow that. Something some of you may have heard about KAP is that we are really focused on the grassroots and that grassroots democracy. So I think it's important just to explain what that is. I didn't know what that meant before I had started. So we do have 12 districts with KAP. We do have 12 district representatives that are on our board. We really do work within each district. There are district chairs and vice chairs and secretaries and their own mini little governance groups within each district. And those farmers who live in those districts are actually able to bring resolutions and other information forward to the biggest table. So KAP being able to bring it to our table and say, hey, this is an issue happening in District 10, for example, that people in District 1 may not be seeing. So it allows us to hear from everybody in the province and really focus on what matters most to Manitoba producers. So I'm going to go through this very quick. We do have a board executive of 3 members. We then have the 12 district advisors that are representative of our grassroots democracy. We also have the Commodity Association representation that I've already outlined. So all of those happy smiley faces are people that we work with directly on our board to ensure that we're getting the biggest picture for the Manitoba landscape. So now we're getting to the fun stuff. So I loved this. When I started with KAP in June, so June 14th of 2021, so It feels like yesterday, but it also feels like forever. Things have been going by quite quickly, but there's a lot to do and there's a lot of opportunity for us as an organization. I was faced with, and I think a few of you have probably been in this position as well, examining why do we do what we do and how can we do it better? What is working, what's not working, and how do we kind of step into the future? And that's what I was able to build with our team as well as our board to focus on the future. And, you know, when we started in 1984, there was around 30,000 farms in the province. We're just down to under about 14,000, I think 860 farms. So you can see in that time, we've reduced our farm sizes or farm numbers by 50%, but the farm sizes are actually getting bigger. So our landscape has changed. Our political landscape has changed. Our issues may have changed. Some of them are old issues that are developing into new ones. So we really have to kind of change with the times and also reflect on the past to see what was working. The best way I've been able to describe and try and outline kind of the basis of what the roadmap would be based off of is by building a house. I'm a visual person. I tend to lean on visual aids to outline who we are and what we do. So please forgive how cliche this is. But advocacy, engagement, and outreach, and regulatory modernization are really the three pillars of what we focus on. And I found it was really important to outline that and to especially to pull out that engagement and outreach and to call advocacy, not just policy. Because technically policy is really what feeds into advocacy and communications. But when we say policy, we're talking about more so the research and the understanding of that direct policy, the information, not really what to do with that information next. And that's really what we do every day. So I think it's important to highlight that advocacy and the real value in how engagement and outreach really needs to stand alone as its own. And I'll explain further why that is. The regulatory modernization, we are in an evolving landscape. It's a moving target every day on what the priorities are with government and international markets, and also what's happening here at home, even just within our own home province on priorities within organizations or other regulatory bodies. So we have to be always on that. And a good example is farm safety. We've been legislated under a Farm Safety Act since 1977, but not all farmers understand that they are actually legislated under that act. And so it's important that we're providing tools and helping farmers grow their understanding of that requirement so that we don't end up in a position where there's further regulatory oversight on them. All of that work has to be underpinned by a really good foundation of KAP operations that are slick, efficient, and are positive for not only our members, but also key stakeholders, as well as strong governance. And in order to have that vision valued, which is the top of the house, all of those other things, the pillars in that foundation have to be working really well together. All of that has to be focused on, and really the goals of where I started in my role was ensuring that we were building strategy. There has to be strategy behind everything we're doing. And that's something that has taken a lot of time, but it's been absolutely worth every step of the way. Especially for myself, learning my new role, I think asking the hard questions has been critical. All of that has to be based in strong relationships. And we always talk about relationships in this industry, and COVID impacting that is something that I think we're all a little bit tired of talking about, but it only takes 5 minutes to ruin or even 5 seconds to ruin a relationship of 30 years, particularly when you're dealing with government or other overseeing bodies. So we really need to make sure that we don't only have strong relationships with key stakeholders, but also with the government and other people that we're lobbying to. So that's been a really key foundation. The other goal was to make sure that as we're kind of trying to, we have the house, now what do we do with the house? We have to be really foresight driven. Something that I've seen in agriculture is that we tend to be very reactive. But people along the way have been saying, oh, well, what about this issue? And we go, oh, yeah, but there's other issues that we want to deal with. But at the end of the day, there are issues that if we had maybe reacted better or had planned or had some crisis communication planning, we as a sector would have been in a better position. So I think being foresight driven allows for the people around our tables to share the knowledge that they have and allow us to incorporate that into things like strategy and the relationships that we have, and to really build strong coalitions around some of those maybe predictive issues. So we have better planning and we have better responses. all of that has to be fueled by, and this was something that I really felt strongly about with working with my team, is we should have a real clear outline of our core principles, because decision making is hard and taking leadership can be very hard as well. As we all work in organizations where, you want to see kind of what is guiding this group of people and how they're making their decisions. So being evidence-based, continuous learning, relationship focused, collaborative, those are all very, very important. We have to make sure it's all underpinned by communication and transparency, and most importantly, being solutions oriented. So we can come to the table with government and say, hey, we have a lot of problems, but what are the solutions? And we sometimes rely on government and other bodies to be the ones that are providing the solutions, but that doesn't always work in our favor. So I think if we can come to the table ahead of time with solutions, it makes all of our other work a lot easier and shows that we've done our legwork. I'm going to go through this yet again quite quickly. I don't want to read it all out, but because I think that there's more to talk about at the end here with why policy matters to people like yourselves. But I really want to I do want to explain advocacy and why it's called advocacy, not just policy. It is a really broad umbrella that feeds into communications and really takes that information that comes from that policy work and builds planning. And I have more on in further slides about this. It's so critical to have a good advocacy plan. And why that's important for you folks on the call to know, as fellow communicators and marketers, you have a role in this. And I think what happens in my experience anyway, and I've heard this experience from others, so I know I'm not alone, but sometimes the strategy is already built and then you're expected to communicate it or market it. And you kind of get left behind of, well, this doesn't really make sense, or did we really think about what audience we were going to be talking to about this? So you roll something out that doesn't really sound great and doesn't get really read well. And you say, well, if I, as a marketer or communicator, would have been at the table for that, maybe we would have had more success. So the reason why I'm really underpinning this is, like I said, you absolutely play a role in advocacy as a marketer. Even if you're not directly working in an organization that's advocating, you're working in a sector that is under enormous scrutiny, that there's a lot of policy issues that are happening. So you kind of thinking and always being aware of, hey, what's happening or what's going on in this industry, and I might be influencing that, allows you to be able to participate in certain discussions or sit at certain tables that you may not have been in the past. So really big key actions for us at KAP, that's important for you folks to know, is that we really need to secure and maintain positive government relations. And that would go beyond government too. There are other bodies that we have to lobby, but just positive relationships is really, really important. And then the other aspect of it is securing those support coalitions to ensure unification on key issues. That's really hard work. Pardon me. It's hard work, but that's what I love actually about this job. And I learned that from working on my previous communication files at Cereals Canada, just how important it is to really know who your allies are when you're doing this. So these are just some of the achievements that we've done over the past, I'd say, 8 months. And some of these are really big. So I'm really proud of this work that we've been doing as a team here at KAP. But being able to secure meetings within the department here on a bi-weekly and bi-monthly basis, that's huge. That is something that not everybody has the ability to grow and develop, just because the government can speak to anyone at any time. They have a lot of stakeholders, but we've been able to really work with them and partner with them. And that doesn't mean we always get along with government or we are always on the same page, but we have to work together and we have to focus on solutions. I think the other part when we're talking about advocacy is when there are key issues like the drought this year, if we didn't have a good relationship with our partners, if we didn't have a good relationship with government, a group like KAP would not have been able to sit at the table on developing the agri-recovery plan. So it wasn't up to us what the plan ended up looking like, but we were able to provide direct insight bi-weekly into that planning process. That's critical for our members. That's not only critical for our members, that's critical for agriculture, that we have people at the table that are bringing that broad spectrum approach to some of these issues that are happening. And the drought was very impactful for growers. So that was important. And without those relationships, we wouldn't have been able to do that. Something that we're really focusing on, and I know I had noted it at the end there, is building those support coalitions. So everybody wants to sit on committees, but I always experience that committees are where ideas go to die. So you don't want to have just committees for the sake of committees or coalitions for the sake of having them. They really have to have an intended purpose and very specific outcomes. So when I say we've developed a labor task group and we're rebuilding a farm safety council, these are not where ideas go to die. This is really about getting the right people around the table with really focused outcomes and utilizing those individuals with that knowledge, like I said at the beginning, using their knowledge, their insights to be more predictive of what might be coming in the future, building real communications and outreach programs to producers that are timely and are effective. That's advocacy in action. And that's really taking seriously our charge as CAP into what we have to do and what we have to be in the future. Engagement and outreach, yet again, this is my jam. This is where I get excited. This is my favorite place to be, figuring out how to talk to people, how to listen to people, how to bring that information that we've heard to something meaningful, comes with trust. And as we know, as a sector, that is something that is not stable. We don't always have trust within our peers or within government or with the public. And so we constantly have to be transparent in what we're doing and be focused on building real trust with people, because it does matter. And those meaningful relationships, which is why, having 2 years, as much as we say, oh yeah, COVID was hard, it really was. And people have been able to go back to their silos and not have maybe that accountability that they may have had previously to things that they might be doing. So we really have to make sure that we have trust, we have that transparency, that we can have direct conversations with partners around, hey, what are we doing on this file and how can we do this better? By having here building CAP brand awareness, that's important for us as an organization. But more importantly, it really helps ensure that when we're building our brand awareness, not only, with the government, but with our own members, to ensure that they can trust us to lead the charge and that we're going to take leadership on key files, that will make us more efficient as an industry and as a sector. So really, really positive. So I'm not going to go through all of these. I just wanted to highlight with you guys why some of these things are important, and that you actually, yet again, have a role to play. I have here, talking points and key messaging briefs developed on key issues. That's critical. I think some of us who work in the comms side or marketing side, yet again, we're not always brought in at the beginning. We're sometimes brought in at the end. And that's kind of my call to action for all of you, is to try and find ways in your own organizations to make sure that you're at the planning tables, that you're able to bring your ideas forward. And, when we're talking about talking points and how important that is when we're singing from the same songbook as an industry or as a business, as any organization, that you're there as the expert helping guide some of those conversations, especially because there are always people watching, whether it be media, government, the public. We all really need to be on cue and on point. And that's something here in Manitoba, as we're trying to build a strong advocacy capacity, that is going to be critical. Everybody wants to serve their members. Everyone wants to be providing value to those members. But sometimes in our pursuit of that, we lose sight of the importance of working together. And if we're able to kind of all have agreement and alignment on what we're saying and what we're doing, we're going to find much better success. Another key point is this regulatory modernization. And this is really when we talk about, the evolving landscape of agriculture, and not just our industry, but, energy or transportation, like this would be in any sector. Things are always changing. Things are always being evaluated. I gave farm safety as a good example. A lot of growers don't realize, hey, I have to pay into WCB. I had no idea. We talk about labor strategy. A lot of families have been relying on people who are in their families for employment, but our farms are getting bigger. People are not necessarily staying on the farm to work for their careers. They're going into other aspects of agriculture or into other sectors altogether. So there's a lot of new and upcoming trends that we're already kind of seeing that are going to be really impactful for growers and for the sector as a whole. So we as CAP really have to play a lead role in that. I think another one here, and I have it highlighted, is the environment and climate programs. Minister Bipo has made it very clear that, as well as the government as a whole, these are a priority. There are going to be programs that are going to be developed that will absolutely influence agriculture. And what happens to a farmer will impact everybody else throughout the value chain. So I think, yet again, to make this conversation relevant for you folks on the call, is that paying attention to policy and understanding those trends in that landscape is critical for how we market and how we do communicate. Because if we know that farmers are under enormous pressure, for example, farm safety, we're going to make sure that when we're selling them a product, that we're thinking about, hey, you know, what are the safety precautions that we might want to highlight in this usage, or storage, for example. Maybe there's things that we can do to make their job easier, or even recycling pesticide containers, you know, linking up with Clean Farms, making that information available, talking to people like KAP, saying, hey, you know, I work for a large chemical company. How can we help you share messages on farm safety? I think it's building some of those unique relationships to make sure we're all working towards similar goals, I think is going to be really, really important. I've already hit on some of these things regarding tools that we're trying to develop to build alignment with our partners, have key messages, you know, identify gaps is another big one for us. In the sector, is sometimes we're just a locomotive going, and we miss big opportunities. We have to make sure that when we're working together throughout the value chain or with our own membership, that what are the gaps? Let's try and avoid doing the same things. Let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's try and not duplicate. So doing gap analysis, for example, in labor was really, really important because there's so many people in the labor space, but there are still things not happening. So we have to make sure that communicating and talking to one another and identifying who's doing what has been really essential to our work and what we're continuing to want to do. So to kind of end off my presentation today, because I do want to get into discussion, and I hope we can have some fruitful dialogue around this, because I'm really passionate about this issue, and, you know, the, not even issue, but just this topic around why policy matters. And for someone like me who never thought of policy, this was so outside my wheelhouse prior to agriculture, and then working at a policy organization like Cereals Canada, and now being the general manager at KAP, really figuring out, okay, why does this matter, and how does this matter to what we do as a sector, has been really interesting. So a couple quotes that I think are poignant, but I've heard from people multiple times, so I can't take credit for this, but policy is formed by those who show up. So sometimes if we're working in our corner of our industry and say, where did this policy come from? Or why did the government decide this? Well, they probably did a consultation, and the people that showed up helped formulate that decision. So maybe next time it would be good for an organization like KAP to be invited around that table, or to make ourselves available to participate in that particular consultation. And that doesn't just limit to people who are working in lobbying or advocacy work. You know, as someone who previously, you know, worked actually in the food grocery side of things, now then coming into agriculture, and you have things like you know, nutrition strategies that the government is trying to implement, or the new food guide that are very politicized. Who's going to those events? Who's invited? Who's showing up to that policy being formed? That ultimately will help predict that outcome. So it's important to make sure that you as an organization, or whoever you guys are working for, are we participating in these discussions? Are we making sure this makes sense? The other part is policies developed by many voices saying the same thing. And like I said at the beginning, building consensus, it's not easy. It's the part I think I love the most. So getting to a place where we can say the same thing takes a lot of work, but it's positive work. And that's where that relationships, that trust, all those things I've been saying are really, really critical. Like I said, I would explain a little bit further how kind of policy fits into advocacy and communications. I try to lay it out here as clearly as I could, but when policy is that background information, it's identifying that there's a policy issue or what the policy is. You analyze the policy, you set goals, say, you know, we'd like this policy to state this. Now, what do we do with that? Advocacy is really what we do every day. And like I said a few slides back, is you absolutely play a role in this, even if you are not someone who's directly working for an organization like KAP, because you're part of the landscape of agriculture. You are part of communicating with stakeholders. So being aware of that advocacy landscape is really important, and being plugged into media, but most importantly, like organizations like us, picking up the phone, asking questions are really important, because you may not know what you don't know about a key issue. And then really communicating is critical. Something, yet again, I said at the beginning, we don't do super well on some files, particularly hot button political issues, but we have to. We have to be transparent and we have to be clear. Some of the priorities at KAP, I'm not going to get into necessarily a lot of political detail, because I think that we have a different forum for that, and we have other opportunities to discuss, but business risk management. So farmers take on a lot of risk. They work in a very unpredictable environment, like the weather would be a great example. So business risk management is our programs that producers can use, like agri-stability, or with the drought this year, agri-recovery, that these have been around for many, many years. They don't necessarily always work. So we as an organization are usually trying to provide insight and feedback to government on changing the program so that they work better for growers. Economic development, that's good for everybody, but that's a really high umbrella. So we're talking about infrastructure, we're talking about value add, we're talking about labor. All of those things fit under economic development. It's important we're plugged in on those files. Public trust, like I said at the beginning, we are all responsible for demonstrating the value of agriculture and building trust with consumers and non-agricultural folks. That's something I take really seriously, as well as the environment. When we talk about an advocacy-enabled environment, and I believe this is my last slide, I've been kind of hinting at these things all along the way. And so I hope this would kind of sum it up, and hope that you can see yourself in some of these things. In order for organizations like us to do our job well, we need to have good allies and partners. We need to have a well-defined narrative, key messages. Some of that is built from people like you, making sure that we're saying the same thing. That strong advocacy capacity is really important, that we actually have the ability and the resources to deliver on what we say we're asking for, to come with solutions, that we have those partnerships, that we have strategy, and that we've been planning, we've been talking to the right people, that knowledge and that foresight and all of those steps that we've been taking to get to a place where we have a fulsome understanding, we're actually using that to build good strategy. Having the powerful champions and advocates. So many of us have similar goals, our organizations have similar goals, even if we're competitors, right? So I think that if you can recognize that even though that's my competitor, we actually have shared goals and values, that can actually be really helpful. Knowing your audience, which is something we're all familiar with, and I could underline multiple times, building influential support coalitions, and that does include organizations that you've worked for. I was able to look at the list of who would be in attendance today, and I'm saying hi because there's lots of people I know and some people I don't know, but your organizations, you're a part of that. You're a part of those coalitions, even if you're not exactly at the table every day, because you're a stakeholder in this sector. So maybe if you hear about something that might be going on, or you may not have heard about something going on, but you've noticed it influencing your ability to conduct your work or achieve your goals, make sure you're asking questions to people like myself at KAP and how to get involved and being part of the solution on key issues. Having a mobilized public is really important, and that's where that public trust comes in. And then a clear path and resources for implementation. So when we talk about advocacy and what we're really trying to do, I call it an enabled environment, and there's probably more that we could add to the list, but ultimately it's about it's long-term stuff. The stuff doesn't happen overnight. And I think most importantly, to relate it back to you, is that making sure that those marketers, those communicators, those people that are really talking and listening and are getting the pulse and get that feedback directly from people are part of all of this right from the beginning. So Nathan, I've talked and probably for longer. Yes, I have talked for longer than what I thought I would, but I definitely wanted to get into some questions and dialogue with you. Thanks everyone for patiently listening.
Oh, that was great. Thank you very much, Brenna, for that presentation. It was fantastic. And yeah, learned a lot. And I think everyone here on the call did. So we did have some questions that came through the chat. So if you don't mind, I can read those off to you and you can help answer them for us here.
Sure.
Okay. So let's say, can you give us some examples of some of the non-ag stakeholders that KAP is building relationships with and working with?
That's actually a really good question, and it's something that's really relevant right now, working on the labor file. So labor is one of those, and actually as a former HR manager, yet again, it's one of those like passion topics for me. When we look at agriculture and we look at the needs of what we have right now as a sector. So we have people who work in the hog industry, who are working in barns, or in the feather industry that, are in the processing plants or whatever it may be. There's a huge need for employment and workforce. So that's the technical term, is that workforce. Where do those people come from, right? And what do they know about agriculture? So a lot of times they're non-Canadians. So they might be landed immigrants, or they might be temporary foreign workers. There are organizations that support those individuals and those immigrants that are coming to this country that we've identified as key stakeholders and people that we need to work with and align with, as well as Indigenous communities as well. So there are lots of organizations within the province of Manitoba, for example, who deal with workforce and building workforce within Indigenous communities. We need to be talking to them and working with them. They're non-ag folk, but agriculture has a place for them. And so I think that when we look at our advocacy landscape and the myriad of files that we work on, there's lots of organizations that are working in tandem with us on very similar issues. And I think relying on other partners, and I'll give food and beverage as a really good example, they're really plugged into that from the processing side. So they're seeing really the challenges that those processors are having. Now, we might not be seeing that directly in primary agriculture today, but we will. So why don't we start those relationships with those organizations now? So I think that that's just one example, but there are many, many more.
Oh, that's great. Thanks. And I'll remind anyone that's listening, if you want to ask a question to Brenna, you can still place it in the chat. I'll be able to read it right out of there. So here's another one. So how do you bring alignment on key issues and development of strategy on those issues in the face of divergence?
That's a really good question. So it's interesting, and I kind of relate it back even to my Cereals Canada days, where we had the entire value chain around the table, right? So you have farmers, you have the crop development companies, you have the exporters, and you have end processors. So there's lots of divergent opinions. Something that always could keep me up at night when we would be working on a file, and it's definitely true even as working within the grower community here at KAP, trying to, I would sit in bed and think, okay, like, what is that common ground? What is that piece that's going to get us all working together? So I think that was like a really good place to start, is that when there is major divergence and there isn't alignment, finding that one piece that there could be, I think having a really good starting point, even if it's asking the question, do we do something or do we do nothing? That sometimes can be the question. And what's interesting is when you say that, do we just do nothing? People will say, no, we have to do something. Okay, well, what does that something look like? And then all of a sudden you've gained some momentum. So that's me being sunshine and lollipops, trying to find solutions. Sometimes you also have to be not afraid to take leadership. And I think that can be scary, especially when we all have members and stakeholders that are relying on us to make the right decision. And for them, right? So when an organization like KAP has to make a decision, well, we're in one way or another representing around 14,000 farmers. So how do I make the right decision for everybody? I can't. I have to do my best to assess based off of the data, the information, using real facts when making decisions. I have to look at and analyze all of that. And then from that, take a stand and make that decision. Part of leadership is that you're not always going to be right in those decisions. And I think as organizations, that can be unsettling, but you have to. When there's divergence and you see that you've done your homework, you need to come to a place where you're actually making decisions. So I think ultimately, when you're looking at the landscape of a diverse group of people, which we all are in this sector, there is a lot of commonality that actually brings us together, more than what separates us. And I think sometimes achieving our goals doesn't mean getting it all at once. I think sometimes it's about building long-term plans, having a long-term vision, getting people to think at that 30,000-foot view. And I'm using kind of some cliche statements here, but they actually are real, that it's not going to happen overnight. And sometimes moving that needle, even just a little bit, is better than going backwards. So I'd say don't give up and keep focused on that. And in agriculture, we have a lot that brings us together.
Okay, great, thank you. And I'll have to tell you, you did get a compliment here through the on the background, your KAP background on your Zoom. So your Zoom meeting, yeah, looks great.
Listen, it's because I'm a communicator and I value these things and I love marketing and it's so important. So I appreciate it. And if you're having a bad hair day, it really does help shape your hair. So I advise anyone to get it.
Okay, no, sounds good. I don't know if that was a compliment or kind of an indirect shot at me by that person on not having a
Could be both.
Anyway, good question in the chat here. It says, we like your suggestion about having marketing involved at the beginning of any discussions. This can be easier said than done, as we all know. So do you have any suggestions on how to achieve that? Like how to bring marketing in earlier in the conversation in any organization, really?
I think there's two questions here, actually. I think the first question is, how do you get actually around the tables to be part of that? And then once you get to those tables, how do you become influential? And I think it's a fewfold. So personally for me, and actually I'm going to step back. I have a really good way to answer this, and it's a little bit indirect, but I think that this is something that it stuck out with me. I was at a Women in Ag conference in Calgary. I think I was maybe like 6 months on the job. And the former president or CEO of Dow in the US was there as a speaker. She was really interesting. And I actually sat and had dinner with her that night. And she had said to me, because she was probably in her late 60s, early 70s, so she was definitely one of those first kind of women in agriculture. And she had said, and this would be true for anybody, so this isn't just about a woman in ag thing, but sometimes we create our own barriers by not asking to sit at the table. Sometimes we don't know to say, hey, can I just come and sit in on that meeting? Just as an observer, I just kind of want to hear what's going on that particular file or what's happening. By just asking or showing interest is really yourself pulling up a seat at that table. And I agree, that can be definitely harder, especially if you work in an organization where someone might say, this has nothing to do with you, but you actually may be surprised. So I would encourage anyone on the call to ask if there's opportunities, or you hear, hey, we're working on a big file as an organization right now. Can I just come and sit in on that? I'm not here to participate or anything. I just want to listen and hear what's happening. You may be surprised on what response you get. And I think that's a really good starting point, and has actually, for me, worked on a myriad of files and cases throughout my past 6 years, particularly working in ag. It's been helpful, because what ends up happening is then you can go to that person afterwards, or you can go to your boss and say, hey, I was sitting in on this meeting, and I think they're missing out on something that's really critical. Or, 2 years ago, I think we worked on something like this. Maybe we can show what we've been working on. So it can lead to other things. So I think the first thing is, how do you get to those tables? I think you need to ask. The other thing is asking for mentorship within your organization as well, I think is helpful, because when you go to someone who's senior in your organization or in your industry that you trust and can help build you up, there's a lot of opportunities that come from that. So I think it's getting at the table. So the second question is now, how do you influence that? I think it's actually being really prepared is a big part of it. Understanding your business is really, really important too. And I think that's why when I talk about why policy matters, even if you're working at an ad agency that doesn't just work in agriculture, right? You have a broad portfolio. Understanding the ag issues will help you influence not only your client, but also the outcomes of your business. So I think being very aware of the political things that are happening, or I mean, it's all in the news. There's lots of news releases that come out. Join new lists with the government to pay attention. That's really important. So if you know your facts and do your background, it makes it a lot easier to have those hard conversations. And I think most importantly, when you're looking at influencing, is sometimes saying, you know what, you can have the best plan ever, but if you're not able to communicate it, then we're not going to be successful. And there's lots of examples that I'm sure are very close to the heart of even your own businesses that you can pull from to identify that. So I think sometimes playing a bit of hardball and saying, you know what, we don't want this to happen again. So why don't we start working now together collaboratively as a team to find a resolution to whatever issue they're working on. So that was a very long answer, and I hope I answered it okay. But I think it's a few layers that need to take place to kind of make that happen. But it's absolutely within your influence and control, and is actually a huge benefit for whatever business you're working for.
No, that was a great answer. Thank you for that. And actually, we just had a comment in the chat, and I would agree with it. Great advice about asking for a seat at the table. That really goes a long way. So we have a few more minutes here for maybe one or two more questions. And I'm just looking at the chat. This is more for clarification, I guess. But what one person's asking about the checkoff system early on in the second slide, I believe you'd asked for or explained how the checkoff system sort of funded KAP, and just looking for some clarification on how that works for producers and how that works for funded associations.
Yeah, so we're a bit different than other checkoff organizations. So because KAP is broad, so we're an umbrella group, right? So we have everyone from the Sheep Association all the way through to the grain, oilseed pulses. So and you know, hog production and chicken. So we can get checkoff from everybody. So it's actually a governed act. It's legislated by the government that KAP is allowed to receive a checkoff up to $275 per producer that is sold through or is collected through the sale of their goods. So if they go to an elevator and they sell to Richardson, for example, Richardson will take off at approximately 1% off of every transaction. So we're talking, it's quite small. It takes about 6 months, depending on the size of the farm, to a year to maybe get up to that $275. So it takes a long time to get that, but that's our KAP limit. And we do have a cap. So it's not unlimited. We're not just continually taking from farmers and filling our bank accounts. This is something that's regulated and very controlled. Other associations have, like, for example, canola or wheat would have some like a checkoff that's specific to that commodity. Yet again, it's taking off in small percentages, but there is no cap because it's very specific to that commodity. So it is legislated, it is regulated, and it's not something that is an ever-ending pool of funds. It's something that we're accountable to and responsible for under our funding act.
Great. No, thanks for that explanation. So again, not a lot of time left, but we got a bit of time. There's another good question in the chat here. So how do you navigate all the red tape in the policy and advocacy, having trouble with that word, advocacy space that you work in?
Well, I'm dyslexic, Nathan, so I have a lot of hard time with a lot of words. So don't worry, advocacy is a sticking one for me. That's a really good question. And I think if someone here on the call has the answer, you're hired, because I want to know the answer. This is really complicated. And I think I laid out some of the groundwork of how to overcome some of that red tape actually in this presentation. Now, I'm really fortunate that I have really great mentorship from people who have either worked in government or were MPs. And I mean mentorship literally, like I seek out these people and I ask them questions and they provide me support and clarity, because it takes many people, I think, and all of their years of experience to inform people like me about how to navigate this. And the core things that keep coming out is relationships. And that's so easy to say, like, well, we need to have good relationships. It takes a lot of work and it's not perfect. And I'm not perfect at it. It takes a lot of time. It takes enormous amount of energy. It takes a lot of planning, but that's a huge part of breaking down some of that red tape. Being able to pick up the phone and call a DM or the minister or the minister's, chief of staff, that's huge. That's a really big thing to be able to do. And not everybody can do that, right? And be taken seriously. So I think when we look at the barriers of red tape, that relationship part is absolutely critical. I think another part is when you're participating, and a lot of us do participate on lots of consultations, the government is always consulting on something, environment or, the next policy framework, come with solutions. If you're able to demonstrate and show that you've done your homework and that you're not there to say, well, this isn't working, now what? You're going to be taken a lot more seriously if you're actually coming with a real myriad of solutions, so that you're not just coming with what the problem is. And we all can identify the problem, but how do we actually identify the solution? That allows for that proper ongoing dialogue. I think the other mistake a lot of us make actually is that, for example, when we are meeting with ministers or we are meeting with different politicians or overseeing bodies, we go and we have a lot to say, which for someone like me is all the time. So you really have to plan and prepare on what you're going to say. High level, keep it clear, and always leave with the intention to follow up and let them know that. You follow up with that meeting of, in a month from now, we're going to reconnect on this issue. Not letting things drop. Don't just bombard these people with information. Always be wanting to follow up and keep that ball rolling. Not kick the can down the road, but keep that conversation going on what that solution is. And even if it's just one solution, something minor, identifying that win that's good for them, that's good for you, even if it doesn't get you all the way there, is hugely successful in breaking down those barriers in lobbying.
Awesome. No, great answer. Thank you. So we are running out of time here. So I'll just throw one more question out to you, and then we'll kind of wrap it up after. So if you had a crystal ball, what would you identify as the key public trust metric or message moving forward? Whether they be important for advocacy with government or gaining social license from the consumers, what would you see as being the key public trust metrics?
Who asked that? I know people on this call. Who asked that?
Well, that one came, into the chat here to everybody. So it was
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a really good question. And we need a whole other hour to talk about it. Two things. I want to answer this in two things. So first of all, we need better unification as a sector. And I know everyone's working towards that and we're trying. And we see really good examples of, like when we're talking about messaging and outreach, you can see that there's strides to work together. But even in our own province, every organization, almost every commodity group has their own public trust outreach program. That's creating a lot of confusion for non-ag folks. So I think when we're talking about public trust, we have to recognize that it's not just about the food end product, it's also about the ingredients, and that it is about a singular story that we need to be telling. And every product has something unique. So I don't want to take away from that, because I don't want to discourage people, because that's not the case, but there needs to be better collaboration on the public trust file. I think the other thing is we need to be able to demonstrate what we're doing. And I think that that's where things like a code of practice, particularly on the grain side, and I know beef has done it and pork and others, and chicken and all of that, we need to be able to demonstrate what we're saying and what we're doing, and not just leading with the facts, because that doesn't work and we know that, but being able to say something celebratory, something positive about the sector. And if people want to know more, they know it can be verified and that we have actual metrics on this. So there is no perfect answer. I wish I had a crystal ball, but I think that a really good starting point is, like I said, continuing to work together, that it isn't just about what I think is good as from a KAP perspective, that this is about agriculture as a whole. It's very broad, it's very big, and consumers are very overwhelmed with information. So if we can work together, that's helpful. And I think the other thing is making sure that we're encouraging the sector to find ways to actually demonstrate what we're doing. And a good example is that there's policy right now coming down on environment and climate and carbon tax, which farmers are not happy about. And if we had tools and mechanisms to actually go back to government and say, wait, before you put in a pesticide or a fertilizer reduction, we actually have something that can demonstrate that. Because right now, nothing that we're doing is being taken into account with that reduction. So they've changed the language around the 30%. I think they've just said a reduction at this point, but those are just examples of where, if we're going to really make a difference with the public, we ourselves have to be willing to take a step back and think a little bit differently. Hope that wasn't too discouraging, because I have so much faith and belief in this industry. It's unreal. And the work we're doing is fantastic. It's just about working together better.
No, that was great. And actually, I think that kind of brings us to the end of the presentation, because we're running out of time. But Brenna, I just want to thank you very much for your time in doing this. And it's been really fantastic. So yeah, on behalf of everybody here on the call, thank you very much for doing this. In lieu of a speaker gift, though, CAMA Manitoba will be making a donation to the Ag in the Classroom Manitoba organization.
Thank you.
And I see Sue Clayton on the call today, so I definitely want to give a shout out to her and say thank you for all the work that they do as an organization in helping educate students about agriculture. So that'll be done. And then aside from that, I think that's a wrap. So thank you everybody for joining today. And to learn more about CAMA, please visit cama.org. And we thank you for your support.
Thanks, Nathan. Thank you, everyone.